Welcome again to Tuesday broadcast. As we promised last week, we said that every Tuesday we're going to either tape or broadcast live. This one is pre-taped on Tuesday, and I am happy to welcome to this Tuesday broadcast some of our prominent community leaders and officials. I have around the table, I will start with Judge Sam Salamey, who was a chief judge in Detroit until last December, Chief Judge of Dearborn Court until December for the last 6 years, and we will talk about this in a few minutes. Next to Chief Judge, former Chief Judge Sam Salamey is current councilman and the President Pro Tem of Dearborn City Council, Mike Sareini, and to my right, Gary Woronchak, who was until December the chairman for the Wayne County Commission, and next to him is the newly chief judge appointed to the Dearborn Court, Gene Hunt. We're going to talk about, the first subject we're going to be talking about is Dearborn. Today, on January 15th, Dearborn is celebrating 90 years of existence. Now, how did Dearborn come to exist 90 years ago? That's what we're going to be talking about, and we hope that we can bring you some information that you did not know, and we are going to do this in very short time. So I'm going to start with Gary Woronchak, who was, before he entered the world of politics, he was the editor of the Dearborn Press and Guide for how many years, Gary?
Oh, I was with the Dearborn Press Guide for over 20 years.
And since when?
From 1973 until 1996.
So you have pretty much the knowledge about Dearborn. We have also information about how Dearborn was created back in 1928. So why don't you take us first, from the beginning, how Dearborn came about?
Well, I'll start right with the 90 years ago part, when the Dearborn as we know it now. If you think about West Dearborn, that was actually the village of Dearborn that became the city of Dearborn. And East Dearborn was at one time the village of Springwells, which in the early 20s became the city of Springwells, incorporated as a city. And then a year or two later became the city of Fortson, named after Henry Ford. So you had the city of Fortson and you had Dearborn on the west side. And Henry Ford actually was a big proponent for merging the two sides of town together. There was a lot more developable land in Dearborn than there was in Fortson, so he thought there were some mutual benefits for both communities to get together and merge. So on actually January 8th of 1929, the voters of both communities approved a charter to merge the two communities and elected a mayor, and the actual charter took effect 90 years ago today on January 15th. 1929. The first mayor of Dearborn was Clyde Ford, who was not a direct relative of Henry Ford's, I don't think. But the person who was the mayor of Fortson was named Floyd Yinger. And the name Yinger might sound familiar to you today because there's a Yinger Street in Dearborn. And also there was a councilman, Dwayne Punch Yinger, who served on the Dearborn City Council from the late 70s into the 1980s. So the name Yinger was still around for some time. But Clyde Ford became the first mayor of Dearborn.
Let me ask you a question. We're going to go farther than 1928, but for right now, we're going to continue to talk about the last 90 years, or the beginning of the 90 years. So when Springwell became Fortson, what was the total population of the city? Of the township?
I think around 30,000.
30,000.
Yeah, I think
so
around 30,000.
It was actually the biggest town when they merged Dearborn Township and
Fortson, which was Springwells. Springwells became Fortson, and then they merged with Dearborn.
And what about Dearborn Township? What was it, Dearborn Township?
The village of Dearborn, I don't know exactly what the population was, but I think it was less.
It was less. Yeah. Another person that is familiar with the history of Dearborn, even though he was born in Lebanon, is Judge Sam Salamey, and I'd like to turn to you, Judge, to tell us a little bit about, prior to the creation of Dearborn, what has been the geography is, and how did Dearborn come to be named Dearborn?
Dearborn was settled about 90 years ago, and I settled here about 45 years ago. Yeah. And Dearborn claim to fame is it is the hometown of Henry Ford. However, it's also named after another Henry, and that is General Henry Dearborn. As you know, that geographically Dearborn is at the outskirts of the city of Detroit, and it's very strategically located. And of course, prior to that, when the French, of course, colonized Canada and a part of the state of Michigan, Detroit actually is the French name is Detroit, and then it was later known as Detroit. And Dearborn was a military installation for the French and for the American original settlers in the United States. And during the Civil War, and Dearborn gained a lot of status because it was used as a sort of a bridge, a military bridge to assist the northern states that were assisted by the French during the Civil War, as opposed to the southern states that attempted to cease from the Union, and they were supported by the original colonists, the British. And the intent of France and Britain at the time was to prolong the Civil War in the United States so they will weaken the United States and continue to dominate the world scene. So Dearborn has a lot of history, and of course everybody knows that the roots of the Ford family are from Dearborn, and of course Henry Ford has done a lot, and today the Ford Motor Company and the Ford Land Development, as well as the Ford Foundation, continue to do a lot for Dearborn. As you look around, you see many of the schools in this town are named after members of the Ford family, such as Fortson, Ford, and Fortson, and so on and so forth, and the Ford Estate and the Greenfield.
Speaking of Fortson, I read somewhere that Fortson Tower used to be a military tower for...
I think it was used to monitor, it was high, and it has a sort of a monitoring station to monitor aviation movements. That's what I heard. A lot of people who lived in southeast or south in Dearborn, if you read your deed, it would say aviation subdivision. And the aviation subdivision, because it was used as an aerial strip, it was used for planes. It was a rural airport.
So Fortson High School has more than its high school, as far as... Are you aware of this, Gary, that
yes,
there used to be a tower monitoring, for the aviation?
Right, and as the judge said, it was actually an airstrip area. That's why the streets in the aviation subdivision around Warren and Wyoming, the streets they're actually old runway patterns.
Right. Yeah.
That's why they're so crossing and.
Yeah, that is true. I do know that they're close to Ford Road in Wyoming too. That was where a big part of an airstrip was.
Okay, there is another item that is also significant in Dearborn, which is the building right on Schaefer and Michigan Avenue, which was probably the tallest building. Or the second tallest building in the area, from Detroit all the way to Dearborn. The one that right now it's the Masri Clinic in it. So what's the history of this? You familiar with the history of this building?
I'm not
The
familiar.
Schaefer building. It's a historic building. I don't know much about its history, but I know it was built way back then, and the city for the longest time has maintained it as a historical
actually,
site.
It was a flea market, or it was like a marketplace in the beginning, and then it was the second tallest building, in the area. So
Judge Salamey also mentioned that Dearborn originally was part of a military installation.
Right.
And when you think of our historical museum, you might know that it's called, one of the buildings in the historical museum is the Commandant's Quarters. And that's not just a funny name.
Right.
It was actually, that's actually where the military installation
was. A lot of history
was.
attached to it, right?
Well, I have information in here that says that Dearborn Township used to have more than what's Dearborn today. So Dearborn Township was included the western part of Dearborn, which is West Dearborn,
right,
and also
part of
west of the Greenfield,
right.
Yeah, for
area.
sure.
Yeah.
And also, all Dearborn Heights used to be Dearborn Township. And also part of the Inkster, which is the eastern part of Inkster. So, and also, in addition to all of this, Warrendale, which we hear of all the time,
Right.
that the Warrendale district was part of Dearborn, which is true, it was part of Dearborn Township at that time. So it was much bigger than what we see as Dearborn
The
today.
area of the city today.
So the
yes,
division of Dearborn and taking part, only the west part of Dearborn, to bring it in to Fortson, it was political more than an economic, for Henry Ford. A lot of people say that he had lots of lands in this area and he wants to unify his own land, and that's why he brought in Dearborn to be existing the way it is right now. Any other thing that that about spring wells, and what I heard also, and I've read in the museum, they have a short story about the Fortson. There used to be spring well, that they had actually put up a fight. They did not want to merge with Dearborn Township, and for the reason that Fortson at that time, they were not paying taxes. Most of the taxes were picked up by Ford, and they do not want to share these revenues with the rest of the Dearborn area. And Henry Ford had lots of land in the area, and he wants to merge the
That's
two.
always a motivation for people.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, happy anniversary for Dearborn.
And just one other little anecdote, since we're all politically involved too. When Dearborn merged into one city, the first city charter had a form of government that is very different than what we have today. It actually was not a strong mayor form of government from the beginning. It was actually where the mayor was actually just a member of the city council, and that proved to be very chaotic. And there was a lot of corruption in Dearborn throughout the 1930s. So it was in the early 40s when there was a new charter written that actually created the form of government most like we know now, with a strong mayor with a city council that's the legislative branch.
Well, many people believe that the dividing line for West and East Dearborn is Southfield. Actually, it's not. It's Greenfield.
Yeah.
And in the agreement that was signed, whether it's signed or it's agreed to between Fortson Township and the Dearborn Township at that time, that brokered by Henry Ford, to keep the government of Dearborn the way we see it today, or we know it today, in East Dearborn, which is, in the east of Greenfield.
Right.
Actually, it has been violated. The government, the government, which is the city hall, the police station, and the courthouse. And now, as of 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when the administrative offices moved to west of Greenfield, now everything is not in East Dearborn, is not in Fortson. So there's a violation in here for the agreement, and we should bring it to the attention of the people in charge, since we're celebrating the 90th anniversary.
We have the council president pro tem here. He can
So
carry the message for us.
can we register our complaints?
We'll send it by the mayor's office, see what he thinks.
Okay, well, this is the story of Dearborn.
Yeah.
Of course, we will have more in the weeks to come. We will talk more to other experts. I think that we will be joined next week by a person that has written much of the stories about Dearborn and its history. So we're going to shift to a different subject. We will be back in a few minutes.